All right. Well, hello. I'm Bradley. For real.
None your business.
Yes. So we are we're regular contributors, as most of our audience probably knows, to the DPA Open Mic forum, and we wanted to take a deeper dive into some of the subjects that we oftentimes cover in the DPA Open Mic. And so we kind of wanted to start out just kind of like without as many people that kind of make the conversation sometimes difficult to flow and go all over the place. So we wanted to kind of start out by having a discussion about why we think it's worth even doing a, a recording discussing these issues that we're going to try to delve into. And the reason that we were thinking about starting was basically, how did we get red pilled? Like, what is it that happened that changed our approach, or changed our understanding and how we consume media? Because not everybody's an avid media consumer, right? So like most people that I know usually are not. Like they tune out. They consume media in like one of two ways. And I mean, I live in America, so that's my experience. And so the way that Americans usually consume media is they're either eating it like it's a spectator sport, you know, where it's like my side versus their side, or they're eating it, or they're just completely tuned out. You know, they're they don't want to bother with it. And I don't know which is worse, because the first group of people, it's like, you know, that saying, like, you know enough to be dangerous. Like, you think you know something, but you're just completely propagandized. You know, it's like you listen to Rush Limbaugh or some shit. I don't
Yeah,
know.
no, I agree. And just for a bit of context for people who aren't familiar with DPA Open Mic, Bradley and I met on the DPA Open Mic. It's an open mic that happens every week. Encourage everybody to check it out. It's basically an open mic forum where people from all over the world can come on and we can talk about geopolitics and world events. So it's a great forum. And we decided that we would try our hand at creating our own podcast, just the two of us, to, as Bradley mentioned, to more deep dive on some of these topics uh, with a particular geopolitical focus. So that's what we're doing here today. So we met just now and we said let's hit record and see how it happened. We'll see what happens. So uh, I guess we'll see what happens. Might
That's
turn out
right.
well, might not, but the main thing is we're doing it and
You're
we'll evolve,
figuring it out
figuring
as we
out as we
go.
go along. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. But
So
anyway, these subjects do need to be delved deeply into, though. So either way, even clumsily, we do have to try to get this shit done. So
I guess let's start off by just giving a little bit of an overview of, I guess, who we are as people and how did we get to this point where we decided to do a podcast in 2024.
yeah.
Um, so how has our thought process gotten us to the point where we feel that it's important enough to create a forum where we can, share our ideas?
Mhm.
Because I think that that's important. Most people are very, very passive. So the fact that we're doing this today tells me that we probably have a lot on our minds that we'd like to get off. So I don't know. Do you want to go first, or you want me to kind of throw it out of how I got to where I am with respect to my worldview?
Well, I feel like that's kind of what the subject is already at this point. Kind of like this already, where we've already taken it. Like, how did, like, we get red pilled? You know, how did you kind of get red pilled, and why is it that, you know, just continue basically where you just left off? Like, why is it that it's worth it to freaking discuss these issues? And why is it that they are more discussed than ever before? You know, like, my life hasn't been as like you know, not that you're way older than I am, but you know, you've seen like the media landscape shift a lot more just because you have a longer memory before the internet. You know, But
Well,
we could go ahead.
well, I think to answer your question very succinctly is why are we at where we are now? Simply put, we've hit peak West in the world, and peak Western Empire has hit us, and we are now on the decline. So I think that for a lot of us living in the West, like you said, you're in America, I'm in Canada. For us, we need to be aware that the world that we knew it is rapidly changing, and the world that we knew it is rapidly changing against our favor. So for me, one thing that I've learned, and for me, the answer is pretty simple. How did I end up here and how did I get red pilled? Probably when I realized several years back that for the first time in, really recorded history, modern history anyway, I think my kids are going to be worse off than I am. And, that was always sort of the American dream, the Canadian dream, whatever you want to dream you call it. In the West, if you worked hard, you always had this belief that, you could have a better life for yourself and your kids than your parents had. And
Yeah.
I came to the realization several years back that unfortunately my kids are not going to have a better standard of living than I am. And we're already seeing that. I mean, inflation has gone up by 21% in the last 3 years. So we're all poorer now than we were even a few years ago. So that certainly woke me up as a parent. And just observing, you know, how the Western hegemon and Western influence in the world, since I would argue maybe since the 2003 Iraq War, influence in the world has really been waning, and the rest of the world has been sort of moving away from us. And now that shift away from us is becoming more and more accelerated.
So
And
you're saying it's kind of multifaceted for you because you
sure,
already started getting somewhat of cold feet and get like taking sideways glances at like mainstream media around 2003 Iraq, and it accelerated by like observing just the way that literally your home is, the world around you in your immediate vicinity is changing, kind of like
sure.
what kind of a life your kids are going to be experiencing and how that's different. So it was still a process. It's still a progress, right? We started off with thinking about already not believing a lot of stuff. Like there was not a lot of mainstream or rather alternative media, right, in 2003. And I think about like alternative media in 2003. That's like, I mean, there were websites, I guess, out there, but like I was not that savvy of a media consumer. I was a lot younger in 2003. It's not like in 2003 my media consumption was like listening to NPR and watching news shows that just get shown at cafes. That was my
Sure.
um engagement for the most part.
Well, it's a good point because obviously 25 years ago I was a kid right out of school in my 20s. So I've got a much different view of the world now than I did 25 years ago, but certainly the way the media has changed with the internet has certainly affected everybody's views. Like keep in mind that, even 20, 25 years ago, print dominance was still there. And honestly, in the last 10 years, I couldn't tell you that I've seen a newspaper box anymore. I don't even know
Mhm.
if they exist. So that's one like huge change where we've gone from print, which can be very controlled, to the digital shift, where the powers that be, the big mainstream media outlets, they can't control the entire internet. So we've certainly seen a shift there in the last, I'll say 25 years primarily, but it's really accelerated in the last 10.
So
So
you
I
wouldn't
think
say that print was at some point in time the control over print media wasn't also like dispersed? Because I feel like it used to be a lot more like reliant on things like your newspaper boys route.
it,
So to have a newspaper to do that, usually that was kind of like why there were so many local newspapers and local radio stations too. Wasn't
It
it in the
used to,
90s or something that they started getting bought up? I don't remember.
yeah, it was the 90s. It was Clinton, and I forget the name of the act. I'm sure I could look it up, but when Clinton was in power, and I think it was by 96, he passed some sort of legislative act down in the US that effectively consolidated the power of all these, like you said, the little mom and pop local news outlets and stuff. Basically, whatever resulted from this act, it allowed the big corporations to gobble up even more. And I don't remember the mechanics behind it, but Clinton was largely blamed for that now, in hindsight, because, and I'm pretty sure the year was 96 when they passed that legislation. But that certainly kind of
Wow.
put a clamp down on all the local media for sure.
So yeah, that's like not been the first time that a consolidation over diverse voices in the, the propagandizing of people, or the spreading of ideas, is
Oh God, no,
been,
God no,
so you can
right?
see that this
Well,
is,
keep in mind the consolidation actually started back in the 80s, right? Like I remember when CNN came out, for example. Like I was still a kid, but at the time back in the 80s when CNN came out, that was like a 24/7 news channel.
mhm,
That was the beginning of consolidation because as soon as you've got like a corporate power like CNN, Turner was a big organization back then, and they rolled out things like CNN, which was followed, copied by the Fox Newses and stuff of that of the world. But I would argue that that consolidation has been going on for 50 years at least.
okay. So yeah, like it seems like there was more what's that Oscar Wilde quote where he's like, if America didn't exist, it would have to be invented,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
There's like more um like there's like freaking, how should I put it, like just like imagining, the stereotypical buckskin buccaneer, right, somewhere out in the West, and they're freaking out there, they're doing their own independent newspapers, they got their freaking Pony Express and shit, and it's like after a very intensive effort, finally the media is starting to be consolidated. Everybody's got a TV, everybody listens to a radio, there's a national public radio, there's um you know you're free to go listen to your Rush Limbaughs or whatever, but people are starting to get all of their stuff from the same place, and like it really does make a difference because you know um what it is that you're listening to will impact the way that you think. Like it will.
oh
It
sure.
makes it.
Well, the other evolution of our media too, I think, is like to your point, local media, local news media used to be by definition local, right? So we had a lot more programming back in the day that was specific to a region, right? Like I
Mhm.
remember watching the local news when I was a kid and it was all very specific to where I lived, right? Whereas now, because all these local media outlets have been gobbled up or gone out of business or whatever, you don't have local news anymore, and you just have sort of national news where the powers that be kind of dictate what the news stories are, and
Yeah, and
so
you can
that's
feel it.
unfortunate too.
So that's the
Sure,
thing too, is that okay? You can feel it because okay, if you're reading, you know, people. So if you're reading like any of the major the front pages of the major networks, right, or just the major news sites, whatever,
sure,
like you can already feel like the similarities in language, right,
yeah, yeah,
down to that
for
level
sure,
where you're just like, what is it? Let's say, for example, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, right? Like I was listening, I don't remember what I was listening to today, but they were like the aggressor and the defender, like that's, I've never in my life have I heard people like say things in that kind of weird language. It's almost like, I don't know, biblical or something, like aggressor and defender, like it belongs in some kind of like a metal lyrics, like I don't know, not like something that would seriously belong in the news, like in a geopolitical story, But meanwhile, like Israeli 100% aggression, right? It's completely not framed like that. if that gets brought up, you get deflected. Like you watch it be brought up on any of these major networks, and it's always deflected in the same way, right? They'll
Yeah.
say, "What about October 7th?" Right? So, and that's a deflection, and so you can see that, like, why would I be listening to all of this different shit? It's all the same shit. It's all the same, you know. So people are out there searching for anything that's different at some point in time, you know.
Well,
Just
yeah, and to your point, I also find that another shift that we've seen in our media, not only have the vehicles of, you know, presenting the information. So we've gone from print media, we've gone from cable news to social media, largely where people consume their news now. But we've also shifted, I think, from, I'll call it, fact-based reporting to opinion-based reporting. And that's something that's fairly recent. Like, that's something that's really jumped out in the last 25 years. Like, when I was a kid, news was very boring. It was all very, today this person shot this person or whatever it may be. It was all very linear. It was all very fact-based. And whereas now on the news channels, you have a hard time finding fact-based news because it's all opinion shows. They'll sprinkle some facts in there, but then they'll editorialize about it, and that's all you ever see on Fox or CNN or MSNBC these days.
well, I think
Now the
those
good
reporting
news,
agencies still exist. Oh
sure.
shit! 1 second, I gotta mute.
Now the good news is, I think social media has evolved now to the point where social media has taken the place of the old local media that I mentioned. So your local newspaper has now been kind of replaced with your Facebook group or your X, post or whatever it may be. So I think that the role of social media has been enormous to waking people up to the fact that things aren't going too well. So,
Yeah.
I'll say that maybe 20 years ago ish, around the time of Iraq, you saw really heavy censoring and a lot of propaganda around the Iraq war and whatever other misadventures we were involved in there. Nowadays, you can cut through that. You can cut through the propaganda really simple because everybody's got a phone, right? So everybody's a reporter now. So you can watch your CNN propaganda about, for example, the Israelis, being humane in their bombings. But then you can look at social media and go on X and see a bunch of dead kids that shows the exact opposite of what they're claiming. And you can kind of look with your own eyes and tell what's true and what's not. That's new, right? That's something that largely hasn't existed in human history
Well,
because
okay. Well, I'm
people just
thinking
didn't have
about,
the technology.
well, yeah, but there's a similar effect in history. Just think about, like, for example, in the Vietnam War, how much the U.S. lost, relatively few
Absolutely.
soldiers in the Vietnam War, but those
Yep.
pictures made a big difference, and such a big difference that they didn't allow during the Iraq War to take pictures of.
You got
So
it. Yep.
and so that consolidation of those major media sources where everybody's looking at, and to the, like, that everybody's enthralled by, for example, right, the stuff that gets played at the cafes and the stuff that gets quoted everywhere else, that's the stuff that when there's no difference of opinion, right, or the difference of opinion is something that you can already kind of predict, then it's like, there's 3D there's 3D television now. Why would anybody be looking at the shadows on the cave wall?
Sure.
So
No, but I think you're right. I think Vietnam was a catalyst for a lot of this, right? Because prior to Vietnam,
oh yeah, you're good. That's a good point. Yeah, not
yeah,
just
well,
that, other stuff too.
yeah, prior to Vietnam, you watched your nightly news, and Walter Cronkite got up and said whatever it is he needed to say, and you just believed that like hook, line, and sinker because it was coming from Walter Cronkite. But once you had those journalists going over in Vietnam and reporting back what they were seeing, all of a sudden, like the machine that runs everything kind of said, okay, we can't have this anymore. We got to shut this down.
Yeah,
So, like to your point, the next time we saw a major conflict, which was Iraq, the first Iraq back in 90 or 91, whenever it was, They learned their lesson from Vietnam, and they embedded all of the media into their units so they could
Yeah.
control them. And that's what you saw in both Iraq wars. That's what you saw in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Um,
And so when
so
you say, when you brought up, when one point you brought up earlier was like this fact-based versus opinion-based reporting, like I think that there still exist news agencies. They are still out there. But what's happened
sure.
is like there's a blending between like the news agencies and let's
Mhm.
say government propaganda, I don't know, where like you look at Reuters, and you're just like, is this a news agency or is this like a Ukrainian propaganda mouthpiece? They're just like literally parroting something that some unnamed Ukrainian official said and reporting it as fact or something. So
Yeah.
the news agencies have lost a lot of their credibility over being too partisan, and obviously so. And then the more opinion news channels, which are kind of like more mass media or mass audience facing, the stuff where, you know, fucking Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow or somebody has their audience and, they hypnotize them with their personality and the way they read the news and, their breakdowns and personal opinions and jokes and whatever. So those kinds of news shows, that, yeah, to your point, they became more popular with time. That wasn't always the news. The other kind of news does exist, but it's still not the same, right? The other kind of news, like the news reporting agencies, are still propagandized to hell. Like you go to some website like the Gray Zone, right? And met with like, Max Blumenthal's website. You go there and that's much, much better reporting. Like I say, like Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate have more journalistic credibility in their little fingers than the entire AP staff right now. And that's saying something, because if you're just a reporting agency, it shouldn't matter what you're, at the end of the day, you got a job to do. Like if I have I don't know, if somebody's assembling, you know, my keyboard or something, it doesn't matter if it was assembled by a social conservative or not, it should work. I
Yeah.
don't know. So
Well,
yeah,
I think.
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, okay, well, just to put a point on it, the fact versus opinion based reporting is, I think it's always been a little bit of an illusion, but nowadays it's just much more apparent. It's much more obvious.
Yeah, it's much more obvious because they come out and give you their editorialized opinion. And me personally, that's not what I'm looking for in a good journalist. Uh, on either side, I'd like to see good, honest reporting with facts. And if you want to draw conclusions to it, sure, draw conclusions to it, but make sure that the conclusions are fact based. What I'm seeing in the media now, particularly with the opinion based reporting, there are these sort of emotional appeals where they use these emotional appeals and argumentation to capture readers' attention and provoke reactions,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to looking at the actual facts. So now we're being told to ignore the facts if they are counter to the narrative.
To the
That
narrative, yeah.
Yeah.
It's all about
So
the narrative.
yeah, it's all about the narrative now, as opposed to informing people. News back in the day was meant to inform. Now it's meant to influence, and that's the difference.
But so I feel like, news is, for the most part, it's always been propaganda. And to
Oh, for
look at
sure.
it as anything other than that is a little bit naive. That doesn't necessarily mean like that it's wrong, that it's lying to you or misleading you, right? But it does mean that it's trying to influence you. You could be trying to not mislead people and influence, a different outcome, without perjuring yourself in the court of law or something. So uh,
Mhm.
everybody like tries to express information, from their perspective, so they can't help but to give, their perspective on it as they're even just expressing whatever it is that they think that they saw, which is why eyewitness testimony is very unreliable for a whole host of different kinds of, types of, as evidence for a whole host of different types of, qualifiers. So you're not supposed to, because people are, unreliable. People, could think that they saw things and all this stuff. So, and people will say how they think it is, that's assuming that they're not even trying to mislead you, which people can also intentionally try to mislead you for a whole host of different reasons. So, taking the news from somewhere, it even like everybody that's been in elementary school knows there's two sides to every story, right? So like, even just complaining to your teacher that this happened, even if everything that they said is factually correct, it could still end up in an unjust outcome, So, propaganda is just that information that is meant to try to influence you. And what's happened is, I think that it's more obvious that the information is trying to influence us. It's always tried to do that, but now it's just so on the nose where everybody can see and say like, well, wait, but Ukraine is not winning the Ukraine war. And it does have a neo-Nazi problem, that everybody knows that. In fact, the same exact media was just telling us about that like a year ago, well, now it's been longer than that, So, around 2014, even before then, we had seen all of these news stories, for instance, right? They just get memory hold because it's no longer convenient to the narrative. So, and that's more apparent. People can remember that. It's in our memory. And there's people out there that are sharing those stories and those screenshots, on the Twitter X's of the world.
Well, not only, and yes, I agree with you 100% on everything you just said, but the thing about I'm observing now in the last several years is uh, not only do they want you to follow their narrative and only their narrative, they're starting to shut down anybody who's got counter narratives. And that's not democracy. That's not freedom of speech. So it's become a very dangerous world in that the last several years, in particular here in the West, they're censoring us like it was like communist Soviet Union or something like that, from back in the day. Like if
just trying to
they're
consolidate that narrative power again,
yeah,
we
they
don't have
want to
those
consolidate. Yeah, exactly. Well, with the internet, the genie was out of the bottle, right? So they can't control the internet. It's just too wild, too big, too many countries involved, too many laws and whatever. So it's a bit difficult for them to control, and they realized that several years back. So now what they're trying to do is just censor, just shut down platforms, incarcerate people, whatever it may be. And I mean
But the
that's
thing is
dangerous.
that, okay, well, like eventually it still has to come, like a lot of this stuff still has to come out, right? It's just that they want to
Sure,
be able to, I feel like, roll out the story the way that it is. So I guess I'm going to share one of the stories that I had got queued up.
sure.
It kind of, it's a Ukraine war story, and it really kind of puts a point on this. So everybody can remember how not that long ago it was basically heresy to assume, to suggest, somehow that Ukraine doesn't have a chance at winning the war. That obviously, if you just take a look at the differences in the armies and the differences in the economies and the differences in the weapons, the military industrial complexes of the two nations, the Ukrainians and the Russians, that this is not going to be a fair fight, right? But no, the Ukrainians were these like what is it, what's the term that people love to use, fuck, can't remember. But the
Nazi.
Ukraine. Nazi,
Nazi.
no, I did not see that coming. But like they're basically these awesome warriors that defy all expectations, and they're going to beat the Russians back. I remember having conversations with people, and it would get hostile. They would get emotionally hostile with me when I would be like, I'm not so sure about your idea that the Russians are just going to leave Ukraine once Vladimir Putin gets overthrown because everybody hates him. Like, I don't know what would make you think that, And so now this story came out in September, on September 27th. Like, well, what day is today? Today is October 14th. So this is already not super recent story. This is already how the news is starting to shift. They're going to memory hole all of that, peppy Ukrainians, sticking it to Putin. All of that BS is going to be completely thrown out. And we're going to start going with, already we're going with Ukraine's quote unquote desperate victory plan. So Kiev's desire for Western approval for long-range strikes within Russia will not bring about anything close to decisive victory for Ukraine. So I think that this is national interest. So what they're basically saying is that we're not going to. They're trying to downplay the because a lot of like Zelensky's whole thing is that he was trying to get these long-range missiles to strike deep within Russia, right? And so now they're starting to downplay it, saying, "Oh, it's not going to make a difference."
Well, this is a perfect example of eventually the truth comes out. And, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, all we ever read was how strong Ukraine was. And we heard about the Russians had no equipment. They were fighting with shovels. We were told by the Western media that all the Russians had to fight with was shovels. And they were stealing microchips out of washing machines to put in their missiles because they had, like, we were fed all this nonsense, which anybody who had a bit of intellectual curiosity could go check out and see was complete, false
or just
narrative.
or just like think about it. Like, does that? I feel like if somebody tells you that the Russians are fighting with shovels or with or stealing toilet seats or whatever,
Yeah.
it doesn't even matter who you say that about. The first thing I would be like saying is why is that your story? Like, this is obviously intended to emotionally influence an opinion of some kind. So basically you're trying to say that the Russians are incompetent. Is that that's what the story is? If that was if it was that bad, then it would be apparent. You wouldn't have to spin it that way.
Well,
You wouldn't have to make that narrative.
well,
So
the entire Western narrative is for the last 3 years in Ukraine has been projection. So, whatever the media says about Russia, assume they're actually meaning it about Ukraine. That's what I find. And
yeah,
this example of the story they have is perfect example. So,
you'll be less
think of it
wrong.
as well, yeah, think of it as a person who gets arrested for some crime, right? And they go into the interrogation room, and when they get in there at first and they're sitting across from the cop, they're innocent, and the cop is asking them questions, and then over time, as the cop starts throwing out evidence, you can
Mm-hmm.
see that the person is wearing
Starts to
down.
change. They start to
And
change their.
and eventually they're like, okay, the jig's up. I can't keep these lies up anymore. I gotta come clean and say, tell the truth or some version of the truth. That's what we're seeing here. It's like they can't hide it anymore. So it's kind of like, okay, well, we got to change the narrative now because quite frankly, there's nothing else we can do. We don't have any more weapons to give. There's no many more troops. There's no more money. There's no more will amongst the people. Nobody cares about this conflict anymore. So therefore, we just need to walk away from it. We've gotten what we can from it, and now it's time to back off. And that's what
I
you're
don't think
seeing.
that I don't think they want the narrative to be. We ran out of things to give. Like, even though
Oh no,
that's
no,
slipped through the
that
cracks a couple times, but they
yeah,
they
no,
they want it to be more
yeah, I
this
agree.
right here. Yeah, they want it to be more like the administration appears very cautious while it weighs the costs, risks, and benefits of long-range strike approval. Like, oh, we're like thinking about it, and anyway, it's would make a difference even if we said yes, because the desire for Western approval will not bring about anything close to decisive victory for Ukraine. Like, okay, so all of that talk about how epic the HIMARS, like the destruction of shit in the back of the Russian lines or whatever, that was the same kind of hype then, right? Because, well, I guess in theory you would be able to do that a lot more with the HIMARS. If you have a couple dozen HIMARS systems in there, they can pick out targets, I don't know, more quickly without having to have as much of a huge support logistics shit. I don't know. But anyway, so of course everybody remembers this shit where Keir Starmer visited, the president to get the freaking approval to launch the rockets. The Russians threw a fit. They said that they changed their nuclear defense doctrine, their stance, and then so it's not like we're pissed off that the Russians are basically telling us to back off. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with the fact that it would make a difference anyway. And there have been issues in like stories in the national interest where they do discuss issues with Ukrainian like supply and logistics and shit. But this I don't think this is one of them. I think this is an important story because it like shows a decisive shift in the official narrative. And it's
Yeah.
the official narrative. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in the national interest.
Yeah. So let's say that you're reading this, and you're not you and I, because you and I, we follow this stuff closely. We're the outliers. But let's say you're Joe Sixpack and you're reading this article for the first time in late September. What's the first thing that's going to come to your mind? The first thing that'll come to my mind is, wow, sounds
This
like
word.
Ukraine is things are going really bad in Ukraine. We should probably pull out of there because it sounds like it's a lost cause. That's what I'd be thinking. And the other thing I'd be thinking is, well, what went so wrong? Because a year ago they were telling us everything was great, and now everything's not great. So either something's gone drastically wrong in the last year that nobody's telling me about, or they've been lying to me all along. And that's the other problem with, because of this geopolitical shift that we've been seeing the last, like, I'll say 20, 25 years, where Western power is eroding. You're seeing the propaganda is increasing as the power is eroding,
Yes, yes.
and that has created declining trust in our mainstream media, big time. Trust in traditional sources has declined, partly due to the rise in this information and fake news that the medium themselves are throwing out there. This is not fake news that you and I are coming up with, though that does exist too out
Yeah.
there.
But they're
A lot of
contradicting
that,
themselves, and it's not
yeah,
that long that you can just completely memory hole it.
yeah,
Especially remember how big of a deal the Ukraine subject was in the minds of many Westerners, especially I feel like Americans and Europeans. Like they really, really wanted to see something. Wanted to see the downfall of Putin or something. But okay, so they kind of this is already like near half through, like halfway through the article. They're going like naturally the staunchest supporters of Ukraine are outraged by the current reluctance, which many are calling a betrayal. Washington, however, is worried about the bigger picture. They know approving deep strikes may not only derail chances for peace negotiations, an option Washington wants to keep open, but also open a Pandora's box of escalation scenarios. Putin has declared that a green light for Ukrainian deep strikes would mean the United States, quote, the United States, NATO, and the European countries are at war with Russia, which would take, quote, suitably matched countermeasures, which would take, quote unquote, suitably matched countermeasures. According to Russia's new and less restrictive nuclear doctrine, what might these be? So basically, that's okay. They're hinting about the nuclear doctrine thing, and they're hinting about the desire for making peace negotiations, which I think is you don't make peace with the devil or whatever, with Hitler, right? You don't what did Biden say? For God's sake, this man cannot stay in power. That's kind of been the narrative. The big bad, Putin is basically the new Hitler, and we are going to take him down. But now that it's not working, you can't keep that up. You got to do something different. And now they're saying, openly talking about negotiations. Like, okay, before when the Russians were trying to negotiate, they were telling them no freaking way. Now they're openly saying, oh, well, if we allow them to do this, it'll ruin negotiations. I mean, it's who knows if they'll do it. They could still send these missiles. I think this article even talks about it, that there's a sense of deja vu. We've seen similar sagas of Western weapons supplies throughout this war. Recall the history of the hesitancy to send HIMARS and then NATO tanks, ATACMS, and F-16s each time. America and Germany demonstrated reluctance only to later agree. In each case, the pantomime tension of will they or won't we or won't they is finally resolved. Ukraine gets its weapons and morale is boosted. So, I mean, there's still, I think, I think they'll get away. They'll do as much as they think they can get away with. And the real reason why they think they can't get away with doing this one, or maybe they wanted to get additional leverage before trying to get away with it, is I think this we're going to strike issue. And maybe also I was thinking of speculating that it could also be about Kaliningrad. Go ahead.
Well, keep in mind, no, I don't think it's about Kaliningrad, and I think that the West, led by the Americans, they're starting to see the possibility of negotiations. Because keep in mind, they've been saying absolutely no negotiations for the last 3 years. So now they have to negotiate because they realize they've lost. Keep in mind, we only need to keep this going on for another month or so until the U.S. election.
So
After
everybody
that,
says.
we're going to drop Ukraine like a hot potato. I promise you that. There's no new money for Ukraine. Look at the chaos they had to go through just to get the last tranche through. You won't see any new money for Ukraine. You won't see new weapons for Ukraine because, quite frankly, they don't have any. Right? I think that
Yeah, that's the
NATO.
real reason. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think.
NATO knows the math, right? They know what they do and don't have, and they realize now that they don't have anything left. You're reading articles all over the place. I was reading one just this morning. Germany said to Ukraine, "Yeah, we got nothing left. Sorry, can't help you." Slovakia said, "Sorry, the beggar's bowl is empty on this side. You're going to have to go somewhere else." Right? So we just don't have the weaponry anymore, and we don't have the money.
So
So
speaking back to
we're
the
walking
that
away.
yeah, well, speaking back to that a narrative falling apart business, right? So remember all this time that we were talking about, that we were being told about Russia's massive losses of equipment and manpower, that this was going to, there's no way that they could sustain this. And then when we see recent, COPE sessions with, generals that failed on every front of this war to prognosticate or, predict anything that happened correctly. Basically, they were mostly, or most of them say the same shit, which is, well, who could have known that the Russians would, that same exact trope that we like to say about the Russians, who would have known that they like to suffer so much, like they could suffer so long and they could take such massive casualties, and they could lose so many tens of thousands of tanks, but some still somehow have tanks. Meanwhile, Ukraine's losses are not nearly what Russia's losses are, if you would take the narrative that we have going on. But meanwhile, they're riding around in like soft-skinned vehicles. They're running into issues where they have to take vehicles designed for evacuation of partially damaged equipment, like tanks and shit, like a thing with like a crane on it to like haul stuff. They're taking those and they're like mounting massive machine guns on them and using them as infantry fighting vehicles because they're running out of anything that has any armor on it at all. So I don't trust the numbers about, that I see with regards to either side. When the Ukrainians or the Russians say, this is how many losses the enemy has experienced, I take all of that with, such a huge, massive, tablespoon of salt, that I don't think that it's worth digging too deeply into that. And I also don't think it's worth digging too deeply into the open source intelligence stuff, because it's, Bellingcat is quote unquote open source intelligence. Bellingcat is an MI6 cutout, So how much of that open source intelligence is open source intelligence? There's some good work being done, but there's a lot of BS being done in order for somebody else to be able to point and say, oh, look, Oryx just said that, I don't know how many thousands of Russian tanks were destroyed. I know that Radio Free Europe said that Ukraine started the war with 6,500 tanks. This is what they said, 6,500 tanks, so 6,500 tanks. Then they got every single freaking T-72 that could be sent over to them in Europe, in even the Middle East. People sent them their Soviet tech. Now they've gotten to the point where they're sending them, Leopards and even M1 Abrams tanks, and they're sending them to in really small quantities. It's like dozens. It's not. I don't know how many Leopard 2s have been shipped by now, but they're not sending them over to the Ukrainians in massive, in 6,500 kind of numbers. So I don't know. You take a look at what the evidence shows this late into the war, and it looks like the Russians still have tons of tanks and armored vehicles, and the Ukrainians are definitely having an issue with that, and they're completely reliant on us supporting them. So yeah, the answer is we can't, but the story is it wouldn't make a difference, and we have to be the big boys in the room, and
Yeah, I think that with respect to all the information that comes out on either side, we won't know what's what until it'll probably be decades down the road. That's usually how these conflicts go, right? Because there's so much misinformation on either side with respect to casualties and stuff. Not by design. Usually it's just, hey, we're doing an estimate because we dropped a bomb and we think we killed 30, but in reality we killed 100, or in reality we killed 3, right? You
Mhm.
won't know that until everybody gets accounted for properly through censuses and shit like that, right? But I think that with respect to this war, I mean, it was all misinformation from the start, right? Did Ukraine have a powerful army at the beginning? Yes, I believe they did. I think that they probably had the most well-trained, Western supplied army in all of Europe outside of Russia.
And the largest
But
too,
yeah,
6,500 tanks. Let's just say half of them were not usable. Let's just say, just the worst possible case scenario. Half of them were stored how the U.S. has decided to store their M60s, in a forest somewhere, not really taken care of, and they had to be cannibalized for parts to make the other half work. That's still way more tanks than anybody can even send them. Like who can send them 3,000 tanks? You
yeah.
can't.
So like I said, you're reading this article for the first time, and you're just, Joe Sixpack. You don't really follow geopolitics that much, but you kind of casually follow the news, and you're told that there's a conflict in Ukraine, but you don't know much else about it other than the fact that, hey, we're supporting them and they're good guys and Russia's a bad guy. That's all you need. You read this article, and then first thing you're going to say is, well, what the hell happened? Right? You guys told me we were winning for the last 3 years. So what's happened all of a sudden? So it's just going to make people even more jaded uh, towards the mainstream media, because what we've seen in the last 10 years in particular, this declining trust where everybody feels the need, well, I don't believe anything that mainstream media is saying, so now I have to go fact check everything for myself, right? And this is a new phenomenon. Like, keep in mind the whole fake news. Remember fake news? Fake
Yeah,
news
it was like,
started with Trump,
yeah,
right? I had
I
never
hate
heard it.
that. I hate that freaking term too, fake news. But I mean,
I do too. But
it's become a term of the freaking of the age, in a way. So
But you know
whatever.
what? He was right. He was
Yeah,
absolutely right. Back when he started
he
in
knows how to brand
2016,
something for sure. He
when
definitely
he
has that.
started, well, when he started in 2016, and the media started talking, like when he'd be up doing press conferences or whatever, and he'd be, oh, it's fake news, it's fake news, it's fake news. Everybody, myself included, dismissed Trump as being, well, what does he mean by fake news? Like, this is on CNN, this is news, right? Like, so how is it fake? And that's, I think it was when Trump got in, and when I saw what the media was doing to him, that's when I started waking up, because when Trump was saying things that are fake news, and I myself had, read those articles, or I'd seen it on, social media or whatever, seen it with my own eyes. Well, then all of a sudden, well, no, what the media is saying against Trump and what he's saying, they don't align with what I myself have seen. So I started kind of looking into this stuff more and more. And now, 8 years later, I'm fully on board with the red pill camp, because I think Trump was right all along with the mainstream media. I mean, the Haitian cats and dogs is a perfect example, right? You can say what you want about Trump saying what he did, but the reality is there's lots of videos out there that will show you people cooking, barbecuing up cats and dogs, right?
Yeah,
Or geese or anything else. So it's happening, right? The mainstream media can say that it's not, and they can tell you to not, believe your own eyes and ears, but it
yeah.
still doesn't change the fact that you've seen it. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of people have completely just divorced themselves from the mainstream media
Yeah, and
reality narrative.
maybe to your point, when that happens to somebody, even if they don't understand the full depth of the story, maybe the media is just trying to downplay it and say that, oh, it's not, the problem is not nearly as extreme as people are trying to say,
Sure.
and isn't Donald Trump ridiculous for whatever, right? It doesn't matter. Like, let's say you're not a super sophisticated media consumer and you're like, but I saw viral videos of, people killing cats on the street, and even if your brain doesn't maybe necessarily understand how to draw a logical line from that to the other thing, you're still going to emotionally feel like this is BS, like I know what I saw. So to some extent, when that happens, I feel like people start to just lose in general a little bit of, like they just start to look through, like they start to reject all the propaganda, right? Everything that they think is like propaganda, they start to reject. But that's kind of what one of the things that I was talking about earlier, where it's like the other kind of Americans that engage with the news seems to be like the kind that, that are Glenn Beck, listeners, Rush Limbaugh, those kinds of guys that they're listening to something that is very, for them, politics is like a game that has to deal with like identity and like a horse race like aspect of it. That's it, and maybe even a little bit of a soap opera. Who knows? So, and that's what they do. And the problem with those people is that they think they are very informed. Like they think that they understand what's going on. They think that they've listened to Bill O'Reilly, and a lot of even, let's say, alt news kind of casual media consumers are going to be that way too. I feel like somebody out there is going to listen to Vosh, and somebody out there is going to listen to, what is this, like the quartering guy, whatever his name is, somebody out there is going to listen to, the Last American Vagabond. And so there's still people that kind of do that to some extent. And I feel like maybe there's a little bit of a psychological draw to that. Like a lot of, because like, if you got rid of all of those guys and you put, one, Sean Hannity that would maybe appeal to the lowest common denominator of a lot of those people, you could probably get them to get sucked into the screen and watch that guy again, And
Sure.
so that's why there's a little bit of a crackdown, I feel like, on a lot of stuff.
So I will say something about these pundit types that you mentioned, the Glenn Becks on one side, the Rachel Maddows on the other, the Joe Scarboroughs, all these clowns. I think The View is another perfect example. They're all becoming less and less important and less influential, because I think that the audience has largely figured out that they're all full of it. And their audience are older types, right? Like, so I'm a Gen Xer. I know you're younger than me, you're millennial, whatever, but I'm a Gen Xer. So I recall pre-internet and post-internet. And I think that a lot of the people who still listen to these kind of media programs, they're of the older variety. Kids coming up nowadays, like the whatever they're called, I don't know what they're called nowadays after millennials, whatever, Gen Z, I think. None of them are on board with any of the mainstream media. Like I actually have a bit of hope for the future with the Gen Zs, because they seem to be, they've got a healthy dose of distrust. So I like that.
Yeah. So let's see. We wanted to kind of hit on some other subjects, but we're actually kind of coming up on an hour. So what do you think? Should we probably like wind up the recording and then try to see what we should do, like where we take it from there? Or should we bring up some of these other subjects? Because if we are, you're gonna have to share them with me, because I have not got them written down.
Oh, entirely up to you, man. Like I can talk all day, but I think what we were talking about previously was, number one, how did we get to where we are today? Like,
Yeah,
on this
that's because I
podcast.
really want to nail that before we run out of time. So kind of like what
Yeah, and
was it that
I
red
think,
pilled us in that way? Because
yeah, and
I think that we've
I think for me, like I said, it was coming to the realization that the
your
Western
kids.
Empire is in decline.
Mhm.
And how do I react to that? How do I react to that in a lot of ways? How do I react to that in making sure that my kids have the best, advantages moving forward? How do I, deal with this financially? Like all sorts of things that had popped up once I realized this. So for me,
So
it was
basically, how do
really,
I get informed about the real world? Kind of.
how do I get informed about the real world? And more importantly, how do I plan for the future, knowing that we should expect to see pretty sizable declines in our standards of living here in the West, right?
That's
Some
really
countries
interesting.
will be more than the others, but like, I think in Canada, US, we've got lots of resources, right? So I think we'll fare better than a Japan, for example, or a UK, or one of these countries over in Europe where they're just getting decimated right now because they're all in recession because they no longer
And
have
their
cheap Russian gas.
the prospects are
Right.
decreasing. You can even tell, everybody can.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but for
So
me, it was really once I came to the realization that, things are going to get really bad really quickly because I could see this accelerating. Then I said to myself, how do I protect my family, really? And that's how I started getting more involved in geopolitics because I wanted to understand the world, to your point, so that I could better prepare for it.
yeah. So for me, my obsession, I could say, with geopolitical, uh, the consumption of geopolitical news, right? It is probably a little bit more, eh, uh, how should I say, like more like a hobby or oriented. So I've
Yeah.
always been a news nerd.
Oh, I have
So
too, no doubt, right? But
yeah, so I've
it
always been
wasn't as
since I was a
dire.
kid.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's funny because ever since I was a kid, I was always a news nerd. So no matter what, I know I'd be following the news right now. But I really genuinely think the news is much more interesting today than it was, when I was a kid. Like there's just so
true.
much shit going on. So, and a lot of this stuff is like I feel like people just dip out of it. Like they have kind of a vague understanding, and okay, fine, whatever. Jesus is coming, the economy's crashing. Okay. Also, I'm busy doing something right now. I got shit to do. So like people don't pay attention to that stuff as much. Sometimes like they tune out because it's just like you don't even know where to start. Like what am I gonna do? And probably I don't know if those people are better off than those that just kind of outsource a lot of their thinking to some of their favorite kind of news people. I don't know. Maybe that can, depending on what your favorite like outlet that you consume or that helps you formulate your opinions, depending on what that is, maybe that could be not a super bad outcome. um
I don't know. It's good or it's bad, man. Like on the one hand, um, I feel, I guess the term is red pilled. I
mhm.
guess since I've been red pilled, I find that I'm probably a lot more anxious now than I was, say, 10 years ago, because I'm more aware of what's going on in the world. So, part of me kind of wishes I could go back and being an ignorant guy, but once you get red pilled and once you actually connect all the dots of what's going on with the deep state and the World Economic Forums and all these outfits and how they want to kind of define how we exist and stuff like that. Once you realize how the game is being played, it's really difficult to turn it off. It's really difficult. It's impossible to go back. I've yet to meet a person who's been red pilled who's just been like, okay, I understand all this going on now, but I think I need to go watch uh,
Sports or some
uh,
shit.
yeah,
Get
I gotta go.
distracted
There's some
somehow.
friends reruns on or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So that just doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. It's a good point. I don't think I've met that guy that's both been really, really obsessed with geopolitical events that is also not like interested in like staying out of it, and not in formulating any kind of opinions. I don't know. So I guess a little bit about uh, the way that I don't know, got quote unquote red pilled. Kind of my journey with the news was a little bit more, like I said, it's always been a hobby for me ever since I was a kid. And around the time that the Ukraine war started, it became really the Ukraine. Okay, so let's say for example, 2014 Maidan, right? That was the first news story that I know that the Iraq war stuff was going on, and then um, shortly afterwards there was like a lot of stuff started going on in Syria, and before that there were other there were things were going on, and you always but there was like a little bit of a partisan veneer to it because you had people that were against Bush's war in Iraq were usually doing so from the Democrat perspective, so there's a little bit of like they're the bad guys, we're the good guys kind of left right split, which I think is silly way to look at the issue. But so then around the like Maidan issues, you could really see a split where it was like, no, these people are trying to portray the news in a certain way where it's super obvious that you're going to come away with a conclusion that's substantially flawed, on purpose. Where it's not like being somebody that maybe knows certain things about the region, knows certain people in the region. You could tell that they're spinning it in a certain way. And, of course they spun it before. There's not the first, color revolution, not even in Ukraine. But this time it was a little bit like maybe it was the convergence of the rise of alternative media, the fact that other countries started to have their own kind of propaganda outlets as well. You had RT out there, you had Sputnik, you had I don't know if I'd say Al Jazeera is alternative to our propaganda, maybe, but you had a lot of stuff. Just if you're just reading even just the propaganda from different countries, if you're just reading Haaretz, and then you're reading Deutsche Welle, and then you're reading national interest, right, article that I brought up earlier. If you're just reading those, you already start to bounce around and get a little bit of a different perspective on a lot of this stuff. And
Sure.
that was kind of available to people before, and the sophisticated kind of media consumers, for the most part, I think, still did it that way. But now what's happening is that everybody's got a microphone and everybody's got a web camera, and it's super easy to discuss these issues because not everybody's
we're doing it right now, right?
Yeah, not everybody's knee deep into the stuff, So yeah, I mean, but everybody kind of, like, some people think it's literally it makes no difference. It's all horse politics, but I think that's because a lot of it is meant to kind of distract you and have you running in circles, But meanwhile, there's real shit happening in the world, and you could see just by keeping an eye on what the narrative is and what the narrative was, and taking a look at that difference already, why there is such a crisis of confidence in these institutions,
Well, the problem is the narrative hasn't changed, right? Like, I go back 35 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
When Soviet Union collapsed, and the United States was the sole superpower in the world, the hegemon, the world leader, whatever we want to call it. And the United States has kind of maintained that power for the last 35 years, but that power is quickly and rapidly declining because of the rise of other countries in the last 25, 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, for some strange reason, we've assumed that every other country in the world outside of the Western countries, they won't grow, they won't advance. We're going to keep them down. We're going to have our slave labor shops over in China or the Indias of the
Yeah.
world, and they
Cheap
won't
bananas
improve
and
at all.
diamonds.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So in the last, I'll say, 25 years, let's say, since the China joined the WTO, I'll use that as an example. So in the last 25 years since China joined the WTO in 2001, they have rapidly grown and they've transformed their economy into a global powerhouse. Their supply chain is unmatched in the world. They've got initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative that's expanded its influence all across the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe. Then you've got Russia, same thing. Like, Russia was an absolute basket case after the fall of the Soviet Union. And for about 10 years, it was in really dire straits in the 1990s.
And do
It
you
was
remember the
only,
news about the Russians then? It was very different.
yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely. Right. Oh, yeah. They were all our friends back then. Right. And they just needed our help. Uh,
They're
they
the good
just
guys
needed us
now.
to come in and help them with their
Yeah.
industry. Right. In other words, buy all their companies for cheap and exploit them. That's what we
Yeah.
do.
We just needed to take
So,
their shit.
yeah, so Russia has been growing leaps and bounds the last 20 years because when Putin came in power, he put an end to the gangsterism that Yeltsin had enabled and put up with when he was president in the 90s.
Yeah, it's so
So,
ironic that we call him the thug and the gangster,
yeah, but
Meanwhile,
you have these massive countries, right? Like the Chinas, the Russias, the Indias, the Indonesias of the world. They've all been growing largely because we enabled them to do it because we moved all of our manufacturing over to these countries. they've all been growing, and we, for some reason, expected to maintain the status quo. Doesn't make sense. But that's exactly what we expected, and I'll never know why.
Well, I
But
think that we
the
expected and
narrative
we
didn't
really,
change.
I think we expected and we really believed certain, like we had certain assumptions built into the way that we were operating. Like I think they believed that, and they still say this, you know, you can still hear this narrative pop up, that, you know, Russia is a declining power, that it will continue to get weaker. You know,
Yeah.
and I mean, I don't pretend to be some kind of expert that can possibly understand all the different things that could go into such a calculation, you know, but I mean, just like you're saying, you can see that the world's gone in a different direction than that expectation. You know, there was this expectation, certain expectation set. That expectation is not what ended up happening. But if you were able to successfully cleave off, you know, Chechnya and then go for some other chunk of Russia and then turn Ukraine into a, you know, a knife into Russia's underbelly and then, you know, have all kinds of, you know, continue to undermine the Russians in that way, keep them occupied that way, extend them that way, and then focused on completely isolating China, you know, and blocking them or blockading them or whatever it is that you're going to do. I think that maybe he would have been in a different position, you know, like maybe that was what they were going for or something. But the whole Ukraine war put a stick in their spokes, you know, the proverbial spokes, because excuse me, because it wasn't supposed to go that way. We can see that it wasn't supposed to go that way because all of the news got on board with this same narrative, right? We all know what the narrative was. You know, the Russians invaded. What did Kamala Harris say? Ukraine is a country in Europe. Russia is a bigger country, and they invaded Ukraine. That is bad. So I don't remember what she said. You know, like you shouldn't do that. But like that's that. You know, it's simple, but it kind of reflects the base underlining kind of like current of stream of consciousness of a lot of Americans, where it's kind of like that. You know, where you've always thought that the Russians were a little bit you know, big expansionist power. Really, that's what like a lot of the propaganda kind of helps people kind of formulate their opinion in that kind of in that way. But then you have now you have these guys, right? And they're doing it. They're doing the thing. You know, they're invading small, tiny country. You know, I guess not a tiny country, but you know, comparatively, you look at the map. Russia is probably the only other country besides America that Americans can find on the map. That and maybe like Mexico, and then maybe 3/4 of Americans might be able to find Canada. They might think it's Alaska, you know. So, but that's like
Fair.
the depth of that narrative, you know. That now that narrative is different. So with that, you could tell that the expectation was something else, yeah, than what the outcome was, and now it has to change.
Well, it's typical Western hubris, right? Like we weren't planning on going into a military conflict with Russia. That wasn't in the cards.
You don't think
What
so?
was in the card? No, God, no, no. It was
Oh, you
Swift.
thought what was in is they would either back down or that they would get screwed by the economic
Oh
sanctions.
yeah, 100%. It was Swift. Like when back in February of 2022.
Oh yeah, they did say that was the nuclear option at the
It
time. I
was the
remember that.
nuclear, yeah, the nuclear option. Biden called it the nuclear option, and all they had to do was flip a few switches, and Russia would not be able to access SWIFT, and their economy would crumble. So that was Plan A, right? That didn't happen. So then Plan B was in combination of Plan A, along with this big military buildup that we've got in Ukraine, we'll be able to defeat Russia. So that was the plan, and it didn't work. And it became fairly evident fairly quickly that it wasn't going to work because everybody started bypassing it and finding other ways around Swift. So, and you know, if you've ever gone into Swift and actually logged into it and seen what it actually is, and I have, there's not much to it. It's a settlement system. It's just a way to message each other with your
Yeah,
transactions. So there's nothing overly complex about it. So I'm kind of curious
yeah,
as to
but this is
why
a
that.
super official messaging system.
Gotcha,
Let's
super
put this.
official.
Yes,
So the plan was all along
it's
to
legit.
watch Russia economically crumble, and then we would go in and we would eat up all their industries, right?
Yeah, maybe that's a
Fine.
good point. Maybe if we could keep it alive, if we could keep that narrative alive long enough to keep it going while we just wait for the sanctions to finally take effect, maybe that
Sure.
kind of would make sense why it took them so long to finally turn the ship around. Just now we're going like, okay, yeah, maybe we want to do negotiations. Oh, now we want to do negotiations. Okay, what about the Russians, right? This is like did you ask them if they're in the mood to negotiate with you now after you did that shit? After you pulled that stunt, maybe maybe after what they have, what was that story that came out where the Russians are doing war crimes. There's like some video of them killing 9 drone operators or something like this in Kursk, right? And it's just like, yeah, I mean, eventually, you can even just hear these guys, the way that they talk. They're like, when we're taking these, MFers in Kursk, we're going to like not take any prisoners, right? Because they're pissed off because they invaded them, So it's like you can see that there's like just the heated nature of the war, but that story kind of gets reported in that way. Meanwhile, the huge, like numerous Ukrainian war crimes, right? And you tell people, well, the Ukrainians have fought a dirty war, and actually, when it comes to these heinous war crimes, the Ukrainians are up to their necks. They're much worse than the Russians. In general, I'm
Yeah.
anti-war. Work time causes war crimes, right? As they say, but
Sure.
I mean, both the Russians and the Israelis make them both look like they're just playing patty cakes, I guess. But between the two, like it's like a different level of how bad the Ukrainians are, compared to the other guys. But the narrative is still, big bad Russians. So I think that part of the narrative won't change. That part of the narrative is sacrosanct.
Yeah.
But the part of the narrative that will have to go ahead.
Oh no, finish off and all.
Okay, yeah, but the part of the narrative that will have to start adapting is the, plucky. I think that's the term I was looking for earlier. Plucky, the plucky Ukrainians, defending themselves against, an unreasonable expansionist kind of like empire. They're going to have to start saying, oh, the Ukrainians are awesome fighters, but also, they are kind of corrupt, and there was kind of a problem with corruption, and Zelensky's kind of corrupt, and everybody around Zelensky's kind of corrupt, and corruption, and screw them.
Well,
Basically, that's kind of how I.
That's what they're doing now. Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing now, right? Zelensky will own this war. He'll own all the blowback from it because
they're gonna throw him under the bus. I think. Yeah.
No question.
So hard, maybe literally.
Yeah, maybe literally for sure. But no, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think we've we're like parasites, right? We've extracted as much as we could from our host, and now it's time to move on to someone else, right? So no, I think you hit the nail on the head. We now need to frame Ukrainian incompetence as being the reason why they lost. It's not, Western might or anything like that. It's all Ukrainian incompetence. So
yeah, even though we know,
yeah,
even though we know that it has a lot to do with the equipment shortages, we know that, right?
Yeah.
They've admitted that. The narrative is not going to be about that, and people that understand really what happened in the war are going to be aware of it. But other than that, the narrative is going to be like kind of what they say here. You're going to say that the Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia aren't going to make a difference. They aren't going to make a difference. Why? Because the Ukrainians are going to lose the war anyway, and it's going to have to be negotiated. And actually, these deep strikes can be bad because you know what? It's going to ruin the negotiations. So how do you like them toast ovens? And at the same time, you have that. While you have that going, right? Other stories are like, oh, well, it's important not to. Yes, of course, the Russians took these massive losses. That's still happening, and of course, they're still the bad guys. Of course, that's still happening, but not as bad as somebody that you can't negotiate with anymore, apparently, because it has to end in that. And so, people are going to be. I don't think this is a narrative that's going to be easy to squeeze by, because a lot of people were tuned into the Ukraine war stuff, even if they've tuned out by now. To hear that in season 18 of the Ukraine war, we all knew how it would happen in the end. The Russians end up, I don't know, taking those oblasts that they annexed, or coming up to the Dnieper River, maybe coming to some kind of agreement on Odessa. Who knows?
Yeah,
People are going to see that as not what they were expecting. Doesn't matter what the outcome is going to be, and they're going to spin it in the ways that we were discussing, in the ways of like, well, big bad incompetent Russia still, haha, we really showed them, but also at the same time.
yeah. I think with respect to Ukraine itself, I don't know. I don't observe where people are really following it anymore. Care. And I think that when the conflict first broke out in February 2022, there was an initial rush, because of the mainstream media, because the media at the time was unprovoked attack, dirty Russians attacking Ukrainians. We need to support the Ukrainians. And look at how pretty their flag is with this beautiful gold and blue colors. And that's all you needed to know about Ukraine. They had a nice flag, and you needed to, put it up on your social media profiles. And Russia was bad. So 3 years later, the narrative hasn't really changed. It's still Russia bad, but I don't think that anybody really cares. Like, outside of, unless you have Ukrainian roots or something, you don't care about Ukraine. It's too localized a conflict, right? So I think that most people in the West, including the governments, they just want to back away from this as quickly as possible. That's why I keep saying, after the
memory hole is in process already. Is in
yeah,
progress.
memory holes in process. All we need to do, let's just get through this election. And after the election, it'll be kind of like Ukraine. What's that?
It's
Who?
interesting that you think it's gonna be so soon. I don't know. I didn't
Oh
predict it would
yeah,
be
I
that
do.
soon. I was gonna think it would be longer, but we'll see. I guess it's an interesting
There's no
prediction
money
to make.
left, right? There's no money left. So it's not like the Americans, in order for them to keep funding this, correct me if I'm wrong, but they would need a new funding bill. And if they need a new funding bill, I can't see that passing,
It's not just
right?
that there's no
So
money left; it's that there's no stuff left. We all know.
right. But
You know.
but it's the money that funds the weapons. So they don't have any money, and even if
Yep.
they did have money, they don't have any weapons. So
Yeah.
what's the like I said, they've extracted whatever
What they
pounds of flesh they can get from the Slavic Ukrainians, similar to how they extracted whatever they could get from the Afghanis, extracted whatever they could get from whoever. It's what we do. So
see.
to
I think
me,
that
I think
Ukraine
that
is a
this
long
one's
term.
ending quickly.
Okay. Yeah. See, I think that Ukraine is a long term holding effort to give the Russians a hard time. You're not going to have the same kind of opportunity in other places. I mean, what happens if Kaliningrad gets attacked by one of the Chihuahua states? Uh,
Uh,
it's going to be a
yeah,
whole different ballgame. You're not going to have the same kind of opportunity. Who knows what the Russians are going to do the second time around? The second time around, they're going to be like, "That's it. We're not messing around with this. We're going to, do a demonstration strike on, their, you know, power plants and missile silos and air defenses for a good measure. And if they try to move a finger, we're going to do a lot more damage. Like they probably would react differently than this. We've been able to ramp up from just sending the Ukrainians helmets to sending them freaking F-16s. So and the media kind of just slowly cranked it up, kind of like that story discussed, where it's like it started out with no way, but every time it ends up going to yes way. So I feel like it's a way to kind of like introduce it into people's psyche so that they're not super shocked when we hear about, oh yeah, what, American F-16 shot down or whatever. Like you have to have some level of accountability, I feel like, in that sense. And
sure.
it's just to take it back to what we were talking about, that accountability, even that elementary level of accountability, that is increasingly lacking. Go ahead.
Well, I think my viewpoint on it, and why I think it'll end sooner than later, and by sooner I mean this thing will be done and dusted within the next year. I'd be surprised if they were still going at it in 6 months from now. And the reason I say that is a couple things. Number one, I think the realization that we've been defeated in Ukraine is dawning on people now. Primarily because, like I said, there are no more weapons and there's no more money to give. And also, I think people are looking at, and I agree with you. I think in a perfect world, they would take that rump state, whatever's left of Ukraine when this is done and dusted. So whatever oblasts Russia ends up owning, the four oblasts, Crimea, I think we can, go under the assumption that if and when there's some sort of negotiated settlement, that'll all be Russia. Whatever remains in that kind of northwestern quadrant next to Poland,
No,
if
that could
that
be Ukraine.
stays, if that remains, Ukraine proper, which I have my doubts it will, but let's assume that it will, that's some sort of rump state of a new Ukraine. Absolutely, I think that the plan would be to kind of keep them as a proxy to keep poking at whatever is remains in Russian controlled Ukraine, but that'll all be part of Russia. That'll be part of the peace plan. Uh, the problem with that, having this kind of rump state that's just there to poke the bear, is you still need resources for that. Number one, which we don't have. You need Russia to agree to it, which Russia never will. Russia will just say, "Listen, as part of this negotiated settlement, we're either going to take all of Ukraine and push everybody out and just take the whole thing, or we'll agree to, having this rump state here as long as it's in our pocket." So they'll install a government that's friendly with Russia, and they'll always ensure that there's a government friendly to Russia. So I don't see necessarily that kind of ongoing Western presence against Russia is always going to be there because number one, I think we realize that we just don't have the strength to take on a Russia. And number two, they've got other priorities right now. Like Israel is a perfect example. They're sending over a battery
Yeah.
of troops, right? So
Yeah.
Israel, people have um, a
Personal
much personal
connection.
reaction with Israel than they would Ukraine. Majority of people don't care about Ukraine. There's a lot of people who care about Israel. So I think the West, led by America, they're shifting over to Israel. They're shifting over to Asia. That's why I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of effort put into a losing cause in Ukraine.
Okay, interesting. Well, I'd love to be able to like peer into the future and see what'll happen, but I guess we can't do that. But all right, so then I guess to kind of wrap up my kind of my journey with the news and being red pilled. So around the Maidan, it became just increasingly hard to get any news that even felt somewhat objective. So I increasingly started turning to these alternative country nations propaganda. Why not? Because I mean, reading our propaganda, smart thing to do is probably read other people's propaganda. And so because just in order to be informed on that conflict in particular, you had to do that. So I would say that that's probably when I became much more engaged in the news, just because I almost like had to, and there was nothing I couldn't go watch a mainstream media news program and listen to what they were saying about stuff that I knew better, than the host does, and just be like, you're so misrepresenting the issue, and you obviously don't even understand it from the beginning. So I feel like I was pushed to have to, join this new alternative media kind of bandwagon just out of
Yep,
necessity for
me as
following.
well. Yeah,
Okay.
100%. No, I agree with you 100%. It's like once you realize what you're being fed is pure poison, you do everything in your power to avoid it. So you end up putting in all the extra work in order to understand what you believe is the truth.
Right.
So,
I wouldn't even
you
say
know,
it's pure poison. I would say that it's very naive to just eat at that trough
sure,
uncritically. Why would
sure.
you do that? You wouldn't do that. And if you did do that, then like maybe there's been a desire for something that along the lines of alternative media for a very long time. Then in that case, because you can't just um, if you're trying to, like you said, like we were talking about earlier, if we were trying to discern how what's going on in the real world and stuff, right, and how it's actually working, then at some point in time, you're not going to be able to just watch Fox News and take everything that they're saying, uncritically. You're not going to be able to, or even read news agencies, or the reporters that are there on the ground. Even they have biases. So I've always been aware that all news is propaganda to some extent, but
See, I wasn't.
I feel like other people joined the bandwagon I was on before in that sense.
Well, maybe that's a generational thing between me and you, because like you just said, you've always had a healthy distrust of the media, the mainstream media, I mean, whereas I didn't, right? So when I was growing up, if it was on the news, like I said, if it came from Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather or any of these clowns, like you basically believed it. And it's like, well, it's on the news, it must be true, right? Whereas
they wouldn't just lie to you like that.
yeah, and so for me, I kind of believed naively for a long part of my life that you know the news was objective, and it's only recently in the last, say, 10, 15 years, whatever, that I've kind of deviated from that view, where I've said, okay, everything that I'm seeing on here is nonsense.
Bullshit.
So yeah, complete bullshit. So I think that it's good that you've always had that distrust because you're a millennial, and like I said about the Gen Zs, I'm feeling optimistic for the future. If the people younger than me are coming up with that distrust, because like we certainly didn't have it. We didn't have it back in the day. That's for sure.
Yeah,
This is
that's
something
probably what's
recent.
meant. That's probably what they mean by institutional collapse of institutional trust or whatever. Is that literally that you're not unique in that sense, where there was a lot more mainstream in the consciousness of people and much more accepted a lot of these like kind of narratives. Sure, there were always
Yeah.
people that were maybe that were mistrustful of the media and before, but maybe it was easier to just kind of like silence those people and say you guys are communists, because this is a Cold War and you
Conspiracy
guys are
theorists or whatever.
conspiracy
Yeah.
theory. Well, I feel like especially during the Cold War when there was communist Russia there, we really cracked down hard on a lot of this stuff. So and infiltrated organizations and I did a lot of this shit, right? So I feel like you had that, like it was more extreme then, where it wasn't just happening to casual people, that it was probably happening to people that were more interested in that movement, right? It's probably why people would be more following every detail. And so you start releasing your socialist college newspaper or whatever it is, and then whoop-de-doo, something happens. Like,
What wasn't it the CIA who created the term conspiracy theorist back in the
yeah,
60s?
it's what I heard, that they started popularizing it around the time of the John F. Kennedy
Yep.
shooting. There's conspiracy theorists, and to turn it into like a derogatory term.
Yeah.
And,
He's a
a
conspiracy
derogatory.
theorist, which means he's nuts. Don't listen to him. That's
Yeah,
how it works.
it's like
Yeah.
shorthand for that. But I mean, the more like people are, when you just talk to people about a lot of these issues, like especially something like the JFK shooting, it's like more people, even people that have barely had any exposure to the other side of that story, right? We're more people that think that the JFK shooting was something sketchy and it was not done by one lone gunman called, Osborne, Oswald or whatever. They like that narrative, even though that's the official narrative and that's the official story and that's what gets taught in all the history books and everything like that, it's still not totally accepted in American mainstream consciousness. And in fact, the more dominant view is that it was the CIA that did it. So we already had even that as far back as the 60s. So some nowadays it's to the point where a conspiracy theorist is almost like every other person. When you talk to them, somebody's got a theory about something that is dubbed a conspiracy theory by somebody else. Like people might talk about, oh, fluoride's bad for you. Somebody's like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Okay, well, so there's a conspiracy theorist everywhere then.
Well, that's the thing. They've come out with all of these labels that they no longer mean anything. Like
Mhm.
everybody can't be a conspiracy theorist. Everybody can't be an anti-Semite. Everybody can't be anti-trans. Everybody can't, you know what I mean? Like, uh,
Anti-vaxxer and
yeah, and
anti-homophobic
that's
and all
what they
that stuff.
do. It's like if you do anything that's counter to the official government narrative, you are labeled. And whatever label it is, doesn't matter if you deserve it or not, you're that now. But the problem is being that doesn't matter anymore, right? So Israel's a perfect example. Being called an anti-Semite in 2024, that's a badge of honor. Are you kidding me?
It's
Right?
lost
Like,
all of its
yeah,
bites. Yeah,
lost all of its
that
bites
term.
because people are like, okay, great. If I'm an anti-Semite, I'm just against this kid who just got their head blown off.
Yeah,
So if being an anti-Semite means that fewer kids are getting their heads blown off, great. I'm all
sign me up.
for it.
Yeah, people are.
So like you said, all of these labels have lost their meanings now because the machine, the media machine that's being controlled by the government, their narratives are outdated, their tactics are outdated, right? So using the same tactics that you used 20 years ago just doesn't work anymore. Like there's the the internet and social media is just too big for people to see through it,
See,
right?
but
So
this isn't like necessarily fact-based reporting either, though. What we're doing is also basically opinion, breaking
oh,
down
for sure.
opinion based, of somebody else's opinion of a story that we,
Sure.
had read and other subjects that we've discussed. People are
But
still seeking
here's the
out
difference
that.
though. Here's
Uh-huh.
I'll tell you the difference though. For me, anything that comes out of my mouth, I don't know about you, but anything that comes out of my mouth, I'd like to think that I've researched it pretty well. And I put a lot of time and energy every single day, as I'm sure you do. Because, like I was saying earlier, back in the day when news was lazy and your consumption of it was lazy, and you just turned on the Situation Room and Wolf Blitzer told you everything that you needed to know, and you just went about your day, that was an easy life, right? But now I
Mhm.
actually have to work for my opinion, right? Because I'll go on CNN and I'll read their viewpoint. Then I'll go on RT and I'll read theirs, and then I'll go on some India site, and then I'll go on Le Monde, and I'll get opinions and media from the same topic from all over the world. And then I'll also dig into social media and see what's going on there in terms of opinions. So for every sort of big ticket thing that I kind of formulate in my head, it's not like I'm getting one or two sites. I'm trying to get as much information on it, and then I'm going to base my opinion on whatever I found. So I might not be right with my opinion, right? But at least I can argue it, right? So you might not agree with me, but at least I'm comfortable enough with whatever's coming out of my mouth that
Mhm.
I can debate it. You know what I mean? And doesn't mean that I'm right, but it means that I'm right enough in my opinion that I'm able to articulate it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it means that you're made an effort to become informed, right? To do
Sure.
a little bit of the legwork necessary required to have a little bit of a deeper, more than just a superficial understanding of a lot of these subjects. So even if you're okay, so the argument is not that okay, it's like you're eliminating all bias, right? But it's like I'm not purposely trying to mislead anybody, first of all, right? And second of all, uh, this is what I'm taking the time to dissect through it, and formulate my thoughts and opinions on it. So um, somebody else is doing that, and their opinions just suck more, So, uh, but so I guess in a way, like to kind of conclude, uh, we ended up not hitting all the subjects we wanted to, but we basically bounced around our main kind of theme, which was the way that we got red pilled out of like the mainstream media like narrative effect, echo chamber or whatever. So like in a way we're here for the same reason, kind of out of necessity for the types of
Mhm.
stories that we were consuming. Mainstream media was increasingly useless,
Mhm.
and kind of just like what you were saying, same thing with me, right? I would be reading around from different, it's not like the only media I consume is alternative media. I still consume propaganda from everybody, U.S.
Yep.
propaganda too. It's important to be able to be looking at these press conferences and stuff, right? In order to even be able to formulate an opinion, you should be able to hear other perspectives and other sides, even if you're like, I don't trust that, even if you're like, oh, I don't trust the freaking Chinese, well, they're still gonna come out, you should still be reading what they say, you should still be paying attention to what their perspectives are. They're still releasing propaganda that is there to be read and is there to be consumed and is there to be analyzed. So I feel like maybe the part of the reason why people then are seeking out alternative media then is to kind of replace those old Rush Limbaughs with somebody else that is maybe more in line with what their thinking is or something like that, and because it continues to basically continue to feed that scratch that itch, if you were, be part of that niche.
For me, it's a little different. Like, I don't necessarily need somebody to confirm whatever biases I might have. I just do all this work just so I'm comfortable in believing that, what I've learned is the truth. You know what I mean? Or as close to the truth as I can possibly get. So if I read CNN, like I said, I'll go on CNN, then I'll go on RT, I'll go on Sputnik, I'll go on, Global Times, whatever, news from all over the world. When you get those different viewpoints of the same topic, you can kind of figure out what's real and what's not. And then kind of formulate your opinion around that. So for me, it's much more, am I understanding the information that I'm getting? Am I understanding it correctly? And holistically, if that makes sense, and and if I'm comfortable in thinking that, then I'm comfortable in saying it. If I'm not comfortable in saying something, I never will. Right? Like, if I'm not, fairly,
confident in your informativeness.
Yeah. Unless I'm fairly confident what I'm saying is reasonably true, I'm not going to say it, because then I'll just look foolish, right? So, and don't get me wrong, I look foolish a lot, but
don't we all?
The effort's always there, right? So I like you said, I'm a news junkie, and there's a reason for that, because I want to make sense of the world, and I want to make sure that my interpretation of the events that are going on is as correct as possible.
Yeah, instead of like the what is it, the X-Files, like, I want to believe. It's like, I want to be informed. Just want to know what's going on as much as I can, as much as,
which is not much to ask, right? Like, I don't ask for much. I just ask that my government not lie to me all the time.
Just want to know.
It's very simple. Yeah, just let me know what's going on.
Is it too much to ask? It is. It is too much to ask. If you had to ask, then you asked for too much. But yeah.
Well, maybe that's the topic for our next episode. I think we were going to talk to about it today, but how the last 20 years have seen such dramatic changes in geopolitical alliances and strength.
Yeah.
That's why we're being lied to. Like, if everything was, peachy keen, there'd be no reason to lie to us. The fact that we're getting lied to tells you that things are going poorly.
Yeah, that there's a reason to lie. There's something to lie about.
There's a reason to lie. You got it.
All right. Well, I would say, like, let's wrap that up, and then I guess we'll see where how we'll do all the technical details side from here on out.
Well, you know what? We've been chatting amongst ourselves for an hour and 40 minutes, so I think we were pretty successful in episode 1, and I hope that we can just evolve and get better at this as we go on.
Yeah, let's see where it goes. Okay.